6:07 Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. You know, a couple weeks ago, I was talking about the border bill that was ultimately killed, that did not pass, and effectively the Democrats, the more conservative Republicans, were able to kill that bill, much to the frustration of the Democrats. And one of the things that I said was that you have these migrants that beat up the cops. Remember that? And it was a big story. And so I, of course, covered it like everyone did. And one of the things that I had mentioned was that really that story and those migrants leaving the police precinct, flipping off the cameras and basically laughing because they were able to leave without having to pay any kind of bail. They were flipping off America. Well, Rand Paul has come to the same conclusion. I love this. Now, we've been reporting the Senate has now passed a $95.3 billion aid package for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, I guess, as well. $95.3 billion. Now, I'm just going to tell you that this legislation is going to be dead. It is dead. It's not going to pass the House of Representatives, the more conservative House of Representatives. And so Rand Paul last night, he had a lot of really good things to say, because guess what? What ultimately this is doing, as you know, it almost sounds cliche now, but it is true, is that the Senate cares more about Ukraine's border than ours. And Rand Paul certainly sees that connection.
Often the titles of bills before the legislature don't really represent what the bill stands for. The title of this bill should say, Ukraine first, America last, because that's what this is really about.
Yeah, you've got a lot of these folks, as Rand Paul calls them, Ukraine firsters, trying to get this thing pushed through, and now they ultimately have, passing it in the Senate, $95.3 billion. Remember, because we keep talking about and going back to the fact that our own border does remain unprotected, and you had the poison pills that was in the border legislation, the previous legislation that did tie Ukraine funding to border security. But there were poison pills, I would say, in the border security portion, so the whole thing didn't pass. And so now the Senate, Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, they've gotten together and they decide, okay, then we're going to come up with a Ukraine funding bill that really doesn't include any kind of border security. We're going to do this on our terms again, and that's exactly what they have done. So you've got some in the Senate that are all in. Chuck Schumer touting this thing as a down payment for the survival of Western democracy and the survival of American values. That's what Chuck Schumer says. I mean, it sounds kind of, bloviating, and it sounds, at least to me, like a bunch of BS. Rand Paul, by the way, agrees with that. A down payment for the survival of Western democracy and the survival of American values. You know what I would ask? What about the survival of America and Americans? And what about protecting our values here in America? Because it does seem like our values are being destroyed. Just look at New York. Just look at Chicago. Just look at Los Angeles and any other Democrat-run city.
Was freed from jail on no bail and gave the middle finger of both hands to America. That's what this bill is. It's the middle finger to America. This bill is the middle finger to every working man and woman in America, every struggling American family. This bill gives them the middle finger and says, we don't care about you. We care more about Ukraine than we care about our southern border.
That's not hyperbole. I mean, obviously that's not hyperbole. They're hoping this bill will force House Speaker, because there's some bipartisanship here, and I'm going to air quote that. They're hoping that this bill will force House Speaker Mike Johnson to get this pushed through the Republican-led House. The Associated Press puts it this way. Democratic and Republican senators who voted to advance the measure hope strong bipartisan support will get it enough political momentum to spur Mike Johnson, House Speaker, to bring it to the House floor. Johnson, however, fired a warning shot on Monday, just minutes before the Senate kicked off its first vote, slamming the bill for its lack of border provisions. I mean, look, there is a reason why Mike Johnson and conservatives in the House of Representatives, and by the way, in the Senate, are trying to hold firm on border protection. It's because the American people expect it. What is most important to you? More than likely, it's going to be the economy and the border and trying to stave off all of this illegal immigration. By the way, it's too late for that. We've already got it. But clearly the politicians in Washington, D.C., their really only concern is to clearly be able to fund Ukraine. Not only for the remainder of the Biden administration, but also in the next presidential administration as well. I'm going to get to that coming up after the traffic because it's really interesting what J.D. Vance has to say. Details straight ahead. But, you know, the debate on the bill, it was going on over the weekend and it continued late last night into this morning. Now, of course, culminating into the Senate passing this $95.3 billion funding for Ukraine, some for Israel as well, and Taiwan. They talk about, by the way, this is part of the narrative today. They talk about the Republican infighting. You've got Ted Cruz and Mike Lee calling on Republican leader Mitch McConnell to step down from his leadership post. So there's a lot of blaming going around. It's a big blame game, if you will. But here's the thing. People are actually blaming Donald Trump. The question is the word blame the correct word to use? Because I would say that Trump should actually get some credit for trying to destroy this bill. Rand Paul making headlines late last night, maybe early this morning. But basically, he is talking about how this Ukraine funding bill is a big middle finger to the American people, because the American people, we have spoken. And we have spoken loudly and proudly that we want our borders secure. And we care far more about our borders than Ukraine's borders. And so when Rand Paul and yours truly and many others have said that those migrants kicking the crap out of those police officers, then walking out of that police precinct, laughing and sticking the middle finger to America, to the cameras, people should be angry. And so when the Kentucky senator says this bill, just like that migrant sticking his middle finger up to all of America, this bill is like another middle finger being hoisted to the American people. You know why? Because they're essentially ignoring what the real concerns of Americans are. And Rand Paul is absolutely right.
We don't seem to care, or these Ukraine firsters don't seem to care about the crime that's happening. They don't seem to care about the assault of a police officer in New York. They're intent on more coming in. Just that one image of that man, that migrant, that illegal immigrant who came across the border and decided to assault with a whole group of other thugs to assault a police officer in New York, just that image alone ought to be enough for us to say enough's enough.
You know, here's what's interesting about what Rand Paul just said, where he says that image alone, we should be saying enough is enough. We, as American people, we are saying enough is enough. Just look at the polling. Even Democrats are calling out some of these other Democrats for welcoming in all of these illegal aliens and, of course, keeping the southern border wide open. There's a race going on in Chicago. I think it's a mayoral race, and you have one Democrat running against the mayor of Chicago, the current mayor of Chicago, who, you know, back months ago, the current mayor of Chicago said, oh, you know, all those Republicans griping about sanctuary cities, they're all racist. And so let's just welcome the migrants to Chicago. You want them? You got them. And now Chicago and Denver and New York and all of these various cities are crumbling under the weight of these migrants or illegal aliens. And so now you've had conservatives saying this for a long time, but now it is the Democrats that are saying it. And so now the question is, when will enough be enough? Well, it'll be enough when the American people start voting out the politicians who are responsible for our wide open border. Now, J.D. Vance, he was talking to Tucker Carlson about this whole thing last night. And he says there's one particular part of this legislation that will tie the hands of Donald Trump if he ultimately wins the election. And that could end up getting Trump impeached if he ends up winning the election. Listen to how J.D. Vance talks about this. It's really fascinating.
In 2019, the U.S. House impeached then President Donald Trump on the theory that they had appropriated money to Ukraine and Donald Trump refused to send it to Ukraine. So if Trump is elected president again and become president on January of 2025, he will conduct diplomacy. And if that diplomacy does not include sending additional billions to Ukraine, there is a theoretical argument, a predicate, if you will, for impeaching Donald Trump because they have tried to tie his hands. And the final point I'll make on this, Tucker, is that the Washington Post has already said, based on leaks from inside the intel community, the purpose of this legislation is to tie a future President Trump's hands. We're not just sending billions to Ukraine in 2024. We're trying to make it impossible for the next president to conduct diplomacy on his terms. It's anti-democratic, and it will lead to endless war all over the world.
Well, I mean, if that is true, and this is from Politico, J.D. Vance distributed a memo to the Senate GOP offices on Monday arguing just that the foreign aid measure could tie Donald Trump's hands if he comes into office next year, wanting to pause Ukraine funding as part of the negotiations on ending Russia's war on Ukraine. So if you've got the American people who, let's say they vote for Donald Trump. Let's say we vote for Donald Trump and we vote for Donald Trump to the point where he actually wins the election. And one of the big reasons why Donald Trump wins the election perhaps would be the border and pausing or stopping or limiting the funding to Ukraine. What the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate are trying to do is ensure that the will of the American people is not carried out. Because you and I, we know that if Trump goes into office, if he wins the election, part of that policy or that platform will be stopping or pausing or limiting Ukraine funding. And so what the Democrats are trying to do and the Republicans are trying to do in the Senate is they're trying to limit the will or stop the will of the American people heading into the next presidential election. That is absolutely wrong. That is, wait for it, I think that's a threat to democracy. Is it not? Yes, it would be. So here we are yet again with the Democrats constantly screaming about Donald Trump being a threat to democracy when in reality, no, that would be the Democrats and sadly some Republicans. Thankfully, we have the House of Representatives where this bill, this $95.3 billion Ukraine spending bill is DOA.